welcome to this lunchtime session entitled Climate Change on the Curriculum, Teaching or Preaching. My name's Harley Richardson. I'll be your chair for this discussion. I write about the history of education and I'm a member of the Academy of Ideas Education Forum, which is supporting today's strand of education debates in this room. Now, this discussion was prompted by the DFE's announcement back in April of a new Natural History GCSE as part of a brace of initiatives relating to sustainability and climate change. Now, the new subject, which will be taught from 2025, will enable young people to, I quote, explore the world by learning about organisms and environments, environmental and sustainability issues, and gain a deeper knowledge of the natural world around them. Some have dubbed this the Climate Change GCSE, and as the DFE's policy paper explains, the GCSE and related initiatives will support the delivery of the government's 25-year Environment Plan and Net Zero strategy. So today's topic is not the details of the GCSE, which are yet to be published. We're here to consider a question raised by this new subject. What is the proper place of an issue like climate change in the curriculum? In particular, is it the role of schools to support government policies such as sustainability and net zero? As the DFE's policy paper acknowledges, there are different views and opinions and different solutions about how climate change can be addressed. So where does that leave teachers, parents or students who don't think, say, that net zero is the way forward? If you're at the climate change discussion this morning downstairs, you may have heard some other ideas about what the way forward might be. Or is the new GCSE actually a long overdue addition to the curriculum, which some have argued has been too matter-of-fact in its handling of climate change? The debate is over, there's an urgent global crisis, the normal rules don't apply, and education is a vital element in the fight to save the planet, it is said. Some have claimed that new GCSE doesn't go far enough and climate change should be central to all teaching. So, is this teaching or preaching? And if it's preaching, is that just what the situation demands? So you know the format, I think. Our panel today have 5 minutes each to give their perspectives on these questions and get the discussion started. I will introduce them in the order they will speak. Can't begin to cover up everything on their CVs, so please do look up their biographies on the festival website. Firstly, on my far left is Dr. Alex Standish, an Associate Professor of Geography Education at University College London and co-editor of the book, What Should Schools Teach? Disciplines, Subjects and the Pursuit of Truth. Next, on my direct left, is Berry Darcy, a parent and environmental entrepreneur who recently chose not to pursue a career as a teacher because she didn't feel she could teach a curriculum with all the important bits taken out. And last but not least, on my right, is Claire Page, a designer by trade, who is speaking here as a parent pursuing 3 formal complaints about indoctrination at her children's school. So I'm looking forward to hearing what they all have to say and then what you have to say in response. It's a short session, so let's crack on. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Harley. My first point, picking up on what Nadhim Zahawi said, that education is an important weapon in the fight against climate change. From a Secretary of State for Education, that's appalling. Okay, education shouldn't be a weapon in anything, because education has its own purpose. But I think that attitude expresses not just his view, but I think a lot of people, when they say there should be more climate change on the curriculum, take that view that that's what education should be for. It should be instrumentalised in the purpose of a bigger political issue. So it's not just Secretary of State for Education, but teachers in initial teacher education where I work, non-governmental organisations. Many people think that that policy, that issue should drive the curriculum, which I think is a mistake because it instrumentalises children for a political purpose. It treats them more as objects for someone else's political project, which is not an educational aim. Okay, if we want to educate children, we need to start with educational questions, which are, how do we prepare children to become autonomous individuals who can think for themselves and can engage with any political issue rather than be just sort of driven, the curriculum be driven by this particular political issue. Issues will come and go. What we need are young people who are educated in the world so that they can engage with any issues, the next issue that comes along, and be prepared and think about how to address that. So my second point, I think, is that I don't know that I'd call it sort of, I mean, maybe there is some preaching, but I think a lot of schools, do take a critical view. But while I think the science of climate change is maybe taught, I'll stick my neck out and say maybe taught fairly well, taught in geography, taught in science. But I think the response to it, the interpretation of the science and the response to it is fairly one-dimensional. So I don't think it's necessarily that teachers are deliberately preaching, although some of them maybe are, some of the more activist ones. But I think the response is largely one-dimensional, and it probably does reinforce an environmentalist agenda. So just to take last week in my daughter's school, they announced a new initiative for eco-uniforms. Okay, eco-uniforms, which obviously are more environmentally friendly. And so it's like on face value, if your children, you see that sounds like a positive thing. Why would you be against eco-uniforms? But I think that's the problem. It's taught very uncritically, and you just get this environmental perspective instead of saying, how could we, what are the different responses? How could we address this? How could we address climate change differently, rather than just sort of changing our environmental behaviours and all, following, environmentalist logic. So instead, could we have a more human-centred response, which says that, we've encountered many environmental problems in the past, such as soil fertility, air and water pollution, a hole in the ozone layer. Historically, we've had lots of environmental problems, but we've overcome or we've improved in response to these. So a human-centred approach is one where we look at humans not as part of the problem, that it's us that needs to change, but that we're part of the solution. Okay, and we can what is it we can do to address climate change and live with it. So what I'd advocate for is having a grown-up discussion with children where we have a grown-up discussion with them about how we're going to live with climate change and global warming, and what are the long-term changes we need to make to energy production and economy and our economies to address greenhouse gas emissions. So I think we need to broaden the discussion and expose children to different ideas, different points of view, as we're trying to do here today.
Thanks very much, Alex. Over to you, Berry.
Can I start with a question? Teachers should always understand prior knowledge in their audience. So can I say I'm the Bleeding Heart Liberal candidate on the panel. Any other Bleeding Heart Liberals in here? Yay, 3 of you. Brilliant. Great. Good to see you, my friends. Right, so my perspective is that this question is about the curriculum, but really you can't talk about curriculum without also talking about pedagogy. So how you teach any subject, and in this case, we're talking about climate change. We can broadly equate that to geography. So Alex and I have a very different opinion on this, and essentially that was why I couldn't go on to be a geography teacher after doing my PGCE and getting a distinction, so presumably I should have been good at that. Because what I found on my degree was that, or my PGCE I should say, was that we tried to teach topics like climate change from the bottom up. So we assumed that if you teach everything there is to know in geography, from rivers to weather to deforestation, etc., that at some level you put all those building blocks in place and kids will get that bigger picture. Now, for me, I think it's actually quite a lot simpler than that. I think we just need to talk to kids, because obviously I think climate change is important, and I think it's going to have significant effects on all of us in lots of unpredictable ways. So I think we can keep it fairly simple. I think we can talk about the causes, and I think we can talk about the effects. Now, that might be teaching a range, so from sort of high-tech emergent solutions like carbon capture and nuclear as a proven technology. I might not like it, but I think we should teach it. Right the way through to sort of intermediate technologies like Paris as a 15-minute city, or low-tech solutions like individual action and also community action, so how individuals organise together at different levels, different scales. So I think this debate is really asking us to talk about the question of responses. So I think causes and effects, fairly straightforward. I think responses is where it gets tricky, and particularly when you're talking about the degree to which you can engage kids in discussions about individual action. Now, I think we must talk about individual action for 4 reasons. First of all, individual action, if you don't talk about it, you're negligent educationally, because it is one of the levers that we've got to deal with climate change. Secondly, if you don't talk about individual action, you're not talking about the root causes of climate change, because we know that it is a cumulative effect of all of our individual footprints. I think if you consider school to be about preparedness for life, and Alex and I may differ on that, then I think you have to make sure that in that time at school, kids have the equipment that they need to become consumers and voters. But I would definitely put that under the umbrella of having the knowledge they need to make their own choices. I do not want to make those choices for them, but I think they need to have that broad range of opinions. And my 4th reason why you must teach individual action is because if you don't, you're fueling eco-anxiety. Eco-anxiety is a completely rational response to the threat that we currently face and that we don't currently have a path to get to 1.5. So that's a rational response, leaving kids with just the cause and effect without giving them the agency that comes with talking about the ways that they can make a difference, I think is quite difficult psychologically for those kids. So do I think that talking about individual action is susceptible to teachers manipulating children? For sure, of course it is. Do I think that we can solve that? Yes, absolutely we can. If we think about different ways that we can instruct teachers through teacher training and training to make sure that they can make those informed decisions and make sure that a wide range of perspectives are put forward. But that means perspectives that are not palatable to you and not palatable to me too, because it's really about putting tolerance and free speech at the top of the agenda. Lots more I could say, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Everyone's coming in under time. The yellow card is doing its business. Over to you, Claire.
Okay, yes, thank you. I have to start with the confession that I know nothing about climate change, but I'm going to try and claim that still qualifies me to talk on this panel, because I'd like to represent in a way the kids and parents who are coming to this naive. And I think that's a really important place to think about, to think about when you're considering school subjects, which is that we begin from first principles and we have an understanding that we are training the innocent mind. And that's a really great responsibility and a privilege. And I think a teacher's job in that case is to leave a mind enriched with facts and ideas and hopefully help kids know the difference between the two. But to also leave a mind absolutely as open as they found it and open to new perspectives and new facts that will come along. So that's my premise. I hope I've got some expertise that are useful to the discussion, because I've also, I've spent time thinking about education law, because I've made a couple of school complaints about politicised teaching in my school, kids' school. It was a different subject, but the same principles apply. And I just want to mention what I learned about that. So the Education Act has 2 really valuable clauses in it. They're called Section 406 and 407. And the first prohibits the promotion of partisan political views to children by teachers. You can still still talk about politics, but you can't give your own view and promote it to the children. And the second clause says that if you do discuss politics, then you must be prepared to give the alternative opinions, and that with balance. And these are just such important clauses, and they're designed specifically to protect children from adult political beliefs being forced upon them. And we know that unscrupulous governments, or governments just looking for popularity, have always targeted children as a way to shape the future political ground and actually to reach their parents through them. And, you know, in the worst case, we think of sort of Nazi youth or Mao's Red Guard. So the avoidance of political indoctrination of children it's not only to protect them, it's to protect a society from a future in which a whole generation think the same thing. That's the moment when we make big societal mistakes, I think. So we also know that children, when convinced of something, tend to hold their opinions very vehemently and can be excessively passionate about them. And that's another reason that we protect children from indoctrination. I think the one thing I noted is that when looking at this law, there's a crucial piece of case law that describes this and worked through these issues. It was in 2007, and very interestingly, it was on climate change. So we've already found the point at which the public and the state are having a disagreement about what is or isn't political here. In this case, the government then, it was Alan Johnson was the Education Secretary, issued the American Democratic politician Al Gore's climate change video to all schools. It's an inconvenient truth. And a member of the public took the government to court about that, feeling that his children were being indoctrinated. The judge made a very sort of messy ruling on that. He said, well, it was a bit indoctrinating because it wasn't properly introduced as coming from a politician. But as long as you give a bit of critique, that's okay, you can show it. Whereas the QC for the member of the public said, we don't need just criticism, we need the alternative view with equal airtime. Somebody who has a completely opposite view being presented. Well, the government, what they understood at that point was that a left-wing politician was advancing his status and interests behind what was now thought of as a consensus opinion. So the government's now gone further and suggested that climate change science and facts are now no longer subject to Education Act and Section 407. You don't need to balance the view on anthropogenic climate change. You don't need to give denial or skepticism. In fact, you shouldn't do, that would be misinformation. So in a way, we can't quite act from first principles anymore. We can't re-ask the question. And the academy must always re-ask the first question, do we still have climate change? What does that mean? So that leaves a huge grey area where which parts of the science are thought to be fact, which form part of the political contentious solutions, and which are just being forwarded by a government that wants popularity. So just to wrap up then, that the result of that, I think, is that political opinion is likely to advance itself behind this sacred subject. And we've seen a growing trend for contestable politics to borrow the certainty of science and advance its programme that way, thinking of COVID, for example.
Thank you. Get your hands up, please, for questions and comments. So we've heard from the panel that education should not be a weapon in anything, let alone the fight against climate change, but also that it would be negligent for it not to engage individual action. Maybe when you come back, Barry, you could be interested to hear a bit more about what you mean by engage individual action. Also, Claire here raising some concerns that, well, I should say, I think there's a surprising amount of agreement on the panel. It seems that we should be having a sort of open knowledge-based discussion about this in schools, but Claire has suggested that this might raise concerns that might not be happening in practice. So let's see, we've got quite a few hands. Let's go to this chap in the front row and then we'll work our way backwards.
Claire just mentioned the inconvenient truth by Al Gore, and that was actually found to contain at least 9 serious factual errors by the judge, I think. It's interesting that we care so much, we talk so much about children's well-being, and especially at school, they're constantly told about how it's important to protect their mental health, and then scare them to death about the climate. My youngest is 15, within year 10 now, but every year since he's been at secondary school, he's had to do some sort of project on climate change, which fortunately, because he's got me as a dad, he's been able to put an alternative point of view. I think when he did his project last year on how the world is going to is burning up, and so we're all going to have to move to Mars, where it's obviously far too cold for anybody to live, and where CO2 levels are at 98%, strangely. I helped him to write his project on that, and when he handed it in, his teacher gave it back and said, someone with an opinion. If we look at the climate change gold standard of the IPCC, which, when politicians use that report's kind of summary and say, oh, look, we're 1 minute to midnight, we're on the verge of burning to death, etc. If you actually wade through the report, you get a lot of talk in the actual 3,000-page report that nobody really reads, that they've got low confidence that floods are increasing, low confidence that there's a lot of speculation about how much CO2. Even if you read the IPCC, they are not certain about what effect climate change is having, and the IPCC itself has been found to have a certain amount of corruption involved. There's a lot of nepotism, a lot of scientists being handpicked, and from various countries around the world to give a diversity of a science rather than the best, rather than finding the top scientists. They have an agenda.
Could you wrap up your point, please?
Yeah, and I just think to present the children that we're facing a clear and present danger, instead of looking at what, as Alex said about humans, the possibility of human solutions, is a very negative way of treating children.
I just wanted to say that I think you probably find lots of friends in the school system. There are plenty of teachers who are teaching in exactly that way. And I know Claire and we've had similar experiences in that that ilk of teaching, does make zealots of the kids. They really do trust the teachers, and they really do believe in them. And it creates a war zone, because, the few kids that maybe, have conversations at home or want to think differently, or are interested in exploring ideas in a broader sense, just simply can't, and are shut down, and it's just toxic, and it's toxic what's happening. So you would probably be very happy in a lot of schools, because you could happily, I've seen lessons, you don't need to have that GCSE, it's already happening. They had to design apps for climate change. They have clubs, they have inset days where they're told to go and protest. It's not a problem, that's happening. It's just, I find it really deeply sad. It's not a question really, ever, that teachers don't understand what education is or should be.
Just on instrumentalisation, I think that's really important, because I do think that the ideology behind this is seeing children as instruments for political action. There's a campaign group called Teach the Future, which is ran by young people, and it's trying to pass a bill to implement climate education at every level of the curriculum as like the foundation of the curriculum. I don't think it will be passed, but it's got quite a lot of support from my own MP Nadia Whittome and Jeremy Corbyn, etc. And if you read this, every element of it is about political action, and they explicitly say, in order to kind of galvanise students to put pressure on the government. And I think that's an incredibly insidious way to approach education. And what's really sad is that it's young people themselves who want this, and they're asking for this. And I'm fairly young, but I've also worked in teaching quite a lot, and I don't trust that children know what's best for them, and I don't trust that they know what they should be educated in. And I think that it's very concerning that we're allowing students to have control of what they're being taught. And I also don't think that eco-anxiety is a rational response. I think that children are told that it's a rational response and they should feel that way. But as the lady said, it's very upsetting. And I don't think it's very productive either, because I don't think that this education is particularly useful for a lot of students. They'll probably learn it, feel quite rubbish, and then go and do whatever they want to do anyway, which isn't probably going to be in climate change or sustainability or anything. And I think what's best is to teach them a very robust, rich curriculum that will make them interested in the world, and maybe some of them might go and work in education, climate change. But if not, I don't think that's a problem either.
Whether climate change should be on the curriculum, well, it shouldn't be if we can't, as a society, have a two-sided debate properly at the highest levels of media and government. If adults can't even discuss it in a reasonable way and hear the other viewpoint, like, criticisms of Al Gore's predictions that in 2008 he said, in 5 years there'll be no ice left. And, well, there's just as much ice now, pretty much. Maybe decreased a little bit, but we don't understand the climate. As the scientists that we claim are all in agreement. Actually, there's a lot of open questions, as the guy over there was pointing out. So yeah, I'm rambling now, but if we can't talk about it, then how can we teach?
There needs to be a sort of two-pronged approach whereby you focus both on individual action that young people can take, as well as voting and this kind of thing. I want to focus on that issue of the second issue of sort of voting and sort of political action. The first thing you need to do is give children a basic political knowledge, because even adults in this country don't know who their representatives are. They don't know what constituency they're in. They don't know when the elections are. When the elections are about to take place, they don't know who any of the candidates are or where to find them. So I do think that this goes for all issues, not just climate change. Any political issue that you want to teach children, indoctrinate children with, whatever, you first need to tell them the basics, that they live in a ward, they live in a council ward, they have a representative, and there's an election every 4 years, and you need to tell them when the elections are and how they can find out who the candidates are. I built some technology that is going to help this.
Yes, we're going to come back to the panel for a couple of minutes each to pick up on whatever they want to pick up from the audience comments. Starting with you, Alex.
Okay, it's not just sort of eco-anxiety that I think young people are experiencing. So if you've seen on the news in the last few days, young people throwing tomato soup at Vincent van Gogh painting, and then the incident in Waitrose with young people pouring milk out on the floor because they want plant-based products. So that's the extreme end. But what we're seeing is that young people are are very anti-human, okay, or a very negative view of humanity and human creations, and and that we should be able to produce meat for ourselves. So they're learning that to put, I guess, the planet first, the environment first, because I think what they're not getting on the school curriculum is enough positive teaching about human experience, about human society, and a sense of progress. So that's what I mean by being one-dimensional. So, and that's not to say that it's just that teachers are deliberately indoctrinating, but I think that's reflecting what's going on in society. That's the discussion in society, that society and the media, every time there's a storm, every time there's an event, it's like climate change is to blame, humans are to blame for the weather. So weather and climate have become conflated now. It's very hard to separate the two. But if they're constantly bombarded with a narrative that humans are to blame for the state of the world, then not surprisingly, they take a very negative view of humanity. So you're going to stop me there. All right.
Okay, thank you. And Berry, please.
Where to start? The lady that mentioned about using the term individual action to kids, I absolutely wouldn't. My son and I we've got a refill station in our garage. We don't talk about that as being individual action. We just talk about that as being a sensible thing to do to help use plastic more than once. So no, I wouldn't use those terms to kids. We're all grown-ups here. In terms of Al Gore and the errors in that, that's not great. But do we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater? Do we have to be purist at this? Do we have to pick holes at things? Or can we try to see each other's different opinions? Or should we just kick the legs out from each other? Is that helpful? In terms of political wards, completely agree. I think it's important that kids understand those structures and that is an option open to them when they are 18. They can't use that mechanism now, so it's just a kind of an understanding. And I think absolutely, whichever their opinion, they should know that the political system is their voice, that it's their way of getting their point across. In terms of Vincent van Gogh and the tomato soup, Of course, that is awful. That's despoiling a common good for all of us. I would never encourage that. I think that, to me, that speaks to children's lack of agency. They don't know how to influence this. They're anxious about it. That's how I interpret Greta Thunberg. She striked because she knew that was shocking, and it was the only area that she had any control over. So I think we need to listen and respond to that and help give those kids agency. And definitely draw a line on tomato soup and milk in any context. To the lady that thinks that climate change is a narrow area of the curriculum and not everybody's going to go on to be involved in climate science, I'd obviously beg to differ, because it doesn't matter whether you're in engineering, home economics, you name it, climate will affect us in so many different ways, which is, the whole concept of a climate. So you can't really duck that one. Ironically, I think the challenge is not to preach about climate change in schools, because I think that's counterproductive. And I think there is a real danger that you'll end up having sort of climate change and home economics, climate change and poetry, climate change and music. And I think that would be really counterproductive. So I definitely don't think that's a good idea.
Yeah, you get another chance. Just on that, by one of the associated recommendations from the government or plans is to make sure that every teacher at further education level has to embed sustainability into their teaching. So that is kind of an example of what you were talking about there at further education level. Claire?
Yeah, so I'll just respond to that one, which I'm glad to hear Barry say that it shouldn't be treated as a tag on with every other subject and spread across. If you're going to take something like that seriously, it should be in science and it should be in geography, which are the subjects that would know how to analyse it properly. And so I would agree with that. But that isn't what the government's doing, and that's perhaps the biggest worry, that what's being asked of it is about a kind of cultural smothering of the entire curriculum with this subject, so that and when you do that, we've actually seen that happen already. We've seen it with race politics, gender politics. We've seen it where, and what's actually going on is a kind of socialistic approach is being spread across other subjects, which allows people to exert their political will in a way that actually doesn't care about the subject. It perhaps doesn't even care about the environment when it's operating in that way. So that's one thing. And the other is just, I'd like to pick up on the use of children, bringing them into adult argument, which I think you mentioned. I just wanted to quote what was said at the time of this court case. So Alan Johnson said, "Children are the key to changing society's long-term attitude to the environment. Not only are they passionate about saving the planet, but children also have a big influence over their own families, lifestyles and behaviours." Now, I'd just say that's wrong. You never, ever use children as a method to politically change their parents' minds. When you do that, you are doing politics wrong. I don't care if it's about the environment or anything else. And this is the part that's really problematic and I think should be addressed and treated with great scepticism. The science, talk about it, that's important. But this method is wrong.
Thank you. Okay. So, last chance to answer or ask questions and make your comments. Got quite a few hands.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly mention that I think talking about how climate reports are unclear is kind of counterproductive or kind of backwards, because I thought everybody would agree that an unclear but definite danger is worse than a clear but definite danger. So, if you don't even know in what ways it's going to affect you, it's even harder to kind of tackle the issue. But I do disagree with Barry on individual action, because I grew up kind of being told that I need to recycle, I need to do the things that, big oil or companies couldn't do. And it's kind of, I think that fuels anxiety as well, and it kind of pushes blame onto the individual instead of kind of, where I agree with the blue man in the blue shirt, instead of kind of showing how in a democracy, you are kind of gathering knowledge and learning how to think critically, and then becoming a good voter or knowing about how to kind of make your voice heard in society about these issues.
Thank you. Come forward.
So I was taught GCSE geography I think in the, I can't remember if it was the late 80s or early 90s. Anyway, in GCSE geography, we were taught about Malthusianism and the population time bomb, and that it was an emergency. And the main person on the other side of the argument was, you may remember, some of you, was Julian Simon. And Julian Simon had this wager with the Malthusian guy who inherited the Malthusian way of thinking about, there's too many of us, the population time bomb means we're heading towards disaster, it's an emergency. And Julian Simon won that wager and he won that debate. But the important educational point is that both those arguments had equal time. And they had equal time, actually, because it was very clear that one side had won, and it was the non-alarmist side. And the point is that, as the gentleman said, we're not having this debate in the public. So it's upstream from the schools. What's happening now in the schools is something that started in the 1970s. So in the 70s, on this, not population, on climate emergency, they were predicting cataclysmic, irreversible climate damage. They were predicting it in the 70s. They were predicting it in the 90s. They're predicting it now. The question is, how many more times do they have to predict it, those predictions not come true, and then you look at the detailed science, and the science does not confirm the emergency. Climate change is real, global warming is real, but the science does not confirm the emergency.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, I want to talk about this idea of science having a kind of cult-like following in the modern age. It's true that science has a different kind of viewpoint on issues, in the sense that it looks at them objectively and it uses the scientific method to come to conclusions rather than starting from the basis of any opinion. Opinions in science begin at a kind of hypothesis level, and then from that hypothesis you can draw conclusions later on, all the while trying to avoid making any subjective viewpoints on the matter. The problem is, we're in a time now where, just as in the past, for example, with cigarettes, where people were mentioning how cigarettes had direct effects on your body and increasing your chances of getting various types of cancer, the cigarette companies who were making money from this didn't want to lose out. So they basically funded projects which would show evidence to the contrary, to say basically cigarettes are not bad for you. So in the same way, are we overlooking this idea that maybe nefarious characters who want to achieve goals for personal aims are able to fund science projects which are actually not science, but they're just projects which back up their own opinions, but they look like science because they're run by scientists.
Thank you. Okay.
At the end of the sessions yesterday, people were outside having cigarettes and saying goodbye, talking to this young woman who looked about 20, and was, oh, what sessions did you do? And she was, oh, I did a few climate ones, and I'm going to paraphrase what she said. She's like, oh my God, there was some like climate change deniers in some of the sessions. And in her mind, since I had a little chat to her, there's like, well, we've won the argument about racism, that's bad. Like, we've won the argument about women's rights, that they're the same, that's good. And we've won the argument about climate change, we're all going to kill the planet. And there was like a sort of certainty in her outlook that argument's been won. But there were people there today that were saying, hold on a minute, let's have a talk about this. You know, I was watching Football Focus the other day.
So, can you get to your question, thanks?
And like a football programme, and they've given out an award to some German footballer because he's done lots of things to save trees. It's so embedded in what we do that here comes the question. It, to me, like, doesn't really matter whether there's going to be a GCSE about it, because it's filtering down from every other part of society that the kids are going to get it from somewhere anyway, and they would have made their mind up whether the school tells them it or not.
Thank you. And this lady here, and then we're back to the panel for the final minute each with their final killer point.
So I totally agree that there's a lot of nuance being lost. I mean, there's a great quote that, you know, if one person is saying it's raining outside, another person saying it's not, you know, the media's job isn't to report on both, it's to look out the window and, you know, ascertain. So I think the problem with, you know, people saying, oh, alternative views always need to be said, is that gives ideas like flat Earth or something ridiculous the same sort of legitimacy as actual at points that need to be made about actually no, if it's not going to be just sort of everybody needs to recycle or whatever. There's not a lot of points being made about actually if there's not a change made at the industrial stage, then we can recycle all we want, it doesn't make a difference. So basically what I'm trying to say is, what I'm trying to say is we should always be kind of encouraging children to do critical thinking, but that a lot of children unfortunately don't understand nuance, and you don't want to create everything being a fight.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so thanks to all of you for your comments and questions. The panel have an impossible task of responding in a minute each to what you just said, but the conversation will carry on at the festival and beyond, no doubt. So Alex, over to you.
I think there's consensus that we need to broaden the discussion out, and I think that starts here. What is the responsibility of the teacher? The teacher should be giving children something that they don't get in the media, and they should be offering them, getting them to explore alternatives. And we should be talking to young people about how we're going to get there. How are we going to get? We're going to use nuclear fission. What other alternatives will enable us to live with climate change and have a better future, and stop scaring children and stop telling them they're responsible by going around their ordinary lives.
For me, it's about the science. I mean, obviously, I'm a true believer. But I came to that view just because of sort of Pascal's wager. You can't know, none of us know the answer to that. And I think it's worse to not act than it is to act. And I don't think the downside is anything to be frightened of. So I'm cool with that. For me, it's about a model of looking at climate change much more like we look at something like obesity. It should be taught across the different subjects. Nobody has any problem with that being taught, and nobody has any problem with mandatory PE lessons, and nobody has any problem with the fact that school clubs will then be provided, and kids may or may not choose to use those school clubs. It's exactly the same idea for climate change for me.
Thank you. Okay, Claire.
Yes, I think I sort of picking up here the feeling that maybe there are geopolitical interests in energy or commerce that are beyond our democratic reach. I think that's how I would sum up what the nervousness is about this. Why would the IPCC always be right and just and fair if we don't get a vote in it? And that, to me, makes this subject too complex for schools, as opposed to universities where you can study the real data with the real studies. In schools, it's a hugely emotive subject, and I think that makes it prey to all sorts of forces that would like to harness the emotional response of children. I think that's quite a dangerous thing. So for me, this is an issue of method. It's not a matter of how urgent a crisis is. It's the method of how you use politics to fix it, and you just don't indoctrinate as the answer to that. You always work from first principles, so I think what I'm saying is that I think there's something more important than the environment, and that is children having open minds. I think they'll fix the environment best if they have those open minds and the full ability to question. I believe there is perhaps a downside to taking those actions. I think it will cost us, and I think we are vulnerable to making mistakes.
Okay, let's thank our speakers.